Hi, welcome to the Electronic Presence Show on the Braitberg Network. I'm your host, Aaron Rabinowitz. Today we have a panel of nationally acclaimed scholars, all of whom are well respected within their fields of technology, presence, and more specifically, how this technological presence is currently affecting our teen generations. Stay tuned. With us here as our first guest is Rudy Volti, who recently wrote a piece describing the winners and losers of technologies. Here he is, Rudy. Come on out. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, so let's just get right into it. I'm sure our audience is eager to hear. Tell me, what did you find when you were examining new technologies and the ways that they affected old technologies?
Well, you see, the disruptive effects of technological change, as seen in my book, can be rarely seen in economic realm. For example, when new technologies led to the destruction of some obsolete firms such as the Pony Express, because they rapidly lost customers after the telegraph was recently invented, wires have been strung across the West. So, in a sense, we have this sort of way of old things need to die before the new things can be born.
Right. And how does the age that we live in now facilitate that? Are there more technologies coming out? Are there less?
Well, I'd say it'd have to depend on the type of structure that goes on with creating new technologies. Because within the past, once in Shanghai, there was this when they had when they were using silkworms to make basically like silk. The Mason Trading Company arrived in and thought that they could monopolize this sort of this business and use like machinery to help build to make more silk.
What happened?
Well, unfortunately it wasn't really an economic success because the high price of the raw materials was not offset by the increased productivity, so it suffered a chronic loss in revenue and it closed down like less than 10 years after it was founded.
So what you're saying is that sometimes, although new technologies are more efficient than their counterparts, they can bring on more destruction than they do good, in a sense that this technology was replaced, and through that replacement, there wasn't much benefit. In fact, many of the other silkworm makers were forced out of business, right?
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, great. Well, thanks for coming on the show. Okay, for our next guest, we have author Nancy Baim, who recently came out with her book called Personal Connections in the Digital Age, in which she examines some of the ways that we use our technologies. I'd like you to welcome Nancy. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course. Okay, so let's start with, I understand that in your book I've been told you discuss some of these concepts that you came up with, and these concepts that apply to how we use our devices. So could you maybe elaborate on that just a little bit for the audience?
Yeah, sure. So I cover 7 key concepts, and these help us to understand the similarities and differences between face-to-face communication and electronic presence communication. And as in
as in us talking right now versus us Skyping or something.
Or exactly, or even over Facebook or something like that.
Okay.
And in my book, Personal Connections in the Digital Age, on page 11, there's a quote which actually represents what we're talking about really well right now, where it says, face-to-face communication, like all forms of digital media, is interactive. It is synchronous. It is also loaded with social cues that makes one another's identities and many elements of social and physical context apparent. And so these social cues and other aspects of these 7 key concepts are really emphasized in face-to-face interaction, where in other types of social interaction, you don't get these social cues. You don't get the face-to-face interaction, and it almost becomes anonymous.
Very interesting. And that anonymity generates what? Less. Did you find that people who communicate anonymously, do they develop more meaningful relationships? Do they develop less meaningful relationships?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the key things is that the main forms of interaction online are asynchronous, which allows people to create these fake personas because they're able to edit and cut away what they would normally say and not even think about what they were saying. But online, they are able to think and edit and cut and make these fake selves that they personify and that they show to the rest of the world. So online, everyone is nearly fake.
So asynchronous in a sense that you can start a conversation at 11 a.m., you can send a text, and then not get a response, until 7 p.m. or something,
Yeah.
right? There's no flow there. It's just as you feel like responding or texting, basically.
Exactly. Texting is a great example of asynchronous communication and a very popular digital media type of conversation in today's day and age.
And I think I was reading some of the book. I read some of it,
Sure.
and I was reading about reach. I was reading about this concept about reach, and
Yeah.
basically how reach applies not so much to face-to-face. In fact, you're limited in face-to-face interactions with reach, right?
Well, yeah, there's also some very positive qualities to digital technology, and some of these are reach, like what you mentioned is with digital technologies, we're now able to talk to people across the oceans and instantaneously. Another very important thing is time, and the constraint of time that we have, because not only are we restricted by how far we can talk to someone, our voice only carries a mile farthest,
Right.
but also the amount of time that it would take to send a letter across the ocean, where now with digital technology it can be sent instantaneously.
Of course. Okay. Well, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
I think that's about it.
Thank you for coming on the show, Nancy.
Yeah,
Always
thank
a
you.
pleasure. Nancy Bam. Our next guest is author James Carey, who wrote a piece called Technology and Ideology, in which he specifically focuses on the effects that the telegraph has had on our electronic presence and the social and cultural dimensions that come with that. So I'd like you to welcome James Carey. What's going on, James?
Hi.
Hi. I'm happy to have you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start first with some of the research that you did on the telegraph and the effects that it had on, 19th century America. Because of course, we all know that the telegraph drastically changed, deviated the course of human history, forever. So how did it do that?
Well, yeah. Prior to the telegraph, there's this sort of isolation between markets. Like you couldn't market with somebody on the West Coast if you lived on the East Coast.
Just because
Physical limitations at the time prohibited that. But when the telegraph came into existence, there was this sort of there was not this sort of separation between communication. As I stated in my book, that there's this belief that before the telegraph, markets were independent of one another, or more accurately, that the effect of one market on another was so gradually manifested as to be virtually unnoticed. And then the telegraph was able to change all that, and by doing that, it basically decreased the sort of spatial limitation, so that you have companies competing all over the country on the same price.
Right. I understand that when the telegraph was invented, the word communicate, literally, I was reading, literally changed. And that prior, correct me if I'm wrong, but prior to the telegraph, to communicate a message required physically, like handing an object to somebody, right? You couldn't communicate a message without means of transporting something. So transportation and communication were synonymous.
Yeah, the most important, I also state this in my book, that the most important fact about the telegraph is one that's most obvious, but yet is innocent. It permitted for the first time an effective separation of communication from transportation.
Oh, there you go. Okay, right. Okay, very cool. Let me ask, what effect did this have on time and how Americans? I understand that obviously time zones didn't exist before the telegraph, so that was something that had to be set up as a result. But in terms of markets, and trading.
Well, in a sense, markets, there is really no time zones. It's all one time, because just because it's 4 o'clock somewhere in one place, that doesn't matter as regards to say it's 2 o'clock in another place. You're still trading, you're still selling, you're still buying, all in the same network. For example, like today, if you were to go on Amazon, for example, it doesn't matter if it's 5 o'clock or it's 10 o'clock. You can buy whatever you want whenever you want because time is not an issue at that point.
And you're saying that's kind of that's what happened in
Basically
America.
what happened in America, but like on the telegraphic scale.
Okay, of course. Awesome. Are there any other points you'd like to make? Any other? Okay, great. Well, thanks for coming on the show, James. Our next guest is scholar Dana Boyd, who recently wrote a book and published it actually online for free called It's Complicated. She's spent many years with teenagers at high school and middle school, in upper levels of education, and just trying to gain an understanding from, for how they use these new technologies that are available to them and how they're affecting them. So, like, welcome Dana Boyd. Hey, Dana.
Hi, thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you for having me on your show.
Of course, Braitberg loves you.
He is a great guy.
Indeed. Okay, so let's talk about Dana. I understand that obviously you've worked with kids quite a bit.
Yeah, pretty much my entire life.
For your entire life. But specifically in this piece that we're going to be talking about, I think it was from chapter 6 of your book where you talk about inequality amongst teenagers.
Yeah.
And how the inequality, although may not be intentional, is still there or is perpetuated.
Well, yeah, so with every new technology, there's this idea that we are becoming less segregated, and that the society as a whole is becoming less racist.
Right.
And it's not.
It was like that Peter Steiner type of the comic, right? Remember the comic where he said on the internet nobody knows you're a dog, right? Less separation.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's an extreme example, obviously.
Everyone's equal, kind of idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, well, unfortunately, the idea of new technologies creating less segregation is completely false. And what happens is actually the opposite.
Oh.
And a great example of this is Facebook and MySpace.
Okay.
Where
two
social media
platforms?
yeah, two social media platforms, yeah. Two social media platforms, and MySpace was the primary social media platform back in the 90s, and everyone used it. And then when Facebook was invented, all of the more privileged kids went to use Facebook, and yet the less privileged students continued using MySpace. And so this idea of isolation was almost reinforced with this new technology being introduced into society.
Were these kids, these upper echelon children, were they trying to make MySpace bad, or did it just?
No, and that's the most interesting part, is that it's totally absent-minded. Like, no one is purposely saying that they're going to segregate these lower class kids to these upper class kids using these different social medias. It's just how the social medias reinforce the boundaries unconsciously through everyone's perspectives.
Yeah, and I was reading how, just along those lines, how basically sometimes the programmers who develop these social media platforms will put their biases into them without even realizing it. Is that part of the reason why this happens? So.
Well, that is definitely part of it. I mean, there's a lot of kids that are constantly being bombarded with these social media segregation regulations, almost because of these programmers have created these social media platforms that enforce these types of behaviors. Exactly.
Yeah. So, let me ask, how do these findings relate back to electronic presence?
Sure. So these social media websites, such as Facebook or MySpace, are where kids are electronically present. Mm-hmm. And in these different social medias, they still facilitate certain racial divisions, but they're less interpreted. But they still exist. So they're less seen and less visible to the world around them. But they're still very clearly there if you take an inquisitor's eye and look a little deeper. And so being present on any platform that allows this anonymity adds more and more of this more and more of these racial divisions.
These racial divisions.
Yeah, of course, exactly. And it's also, kids are able to become meaner and meaner and naturally enforce these divisions more and more.
They're meaner because of the anonymity, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because they feel like they can't be traced back to themselves. And it's almost this separation from their personal selves in the physical world and their electronic presence. And it's a very interesting idea how kids feel that it's okay online to say things since they think they're anonymous.
Very interesting.
And another leading into that is there's this idea of context collapses that occur. That is, I'd also talk about in my book, where kids are extremely mean or do or say certain things that they wouldn't think of regretting ever. But then as soon as the business world or their family sees what they've said about in their friend group, the idea of having multiple different worlds almost, that when they all come crashing together, it's very hard for these young adults to deal with.
Right, like if you have a teenager who's posting about his favorite video game or something, perhaps even a bit less benign, more harmful, like a gang or a group they shouldn't be in, and then he thinks, oh, only my friends are going to see this. That's okay. They're in it with me. But then a college admissions officer checks his Facebook, and that would be a context collapse.
Yeah, exactly. And kids are having a really hard time driving through this almost maze of contexts that they have to.
Thank you for joining us on the Electronic Presence Show on the Braitberg Network. I hope that you enjoyed hearing from these scholars as much as I did, and you learned about what it means to be electronically present in today's world. I'm Aaron Rabinowitz. Have a nice night.
Blazers with shorts.
That's me.
He's on a boat.
Alright, let's do it.
Is this the author?
That was beautiful. Alright, cool.
Drop the mic.
That was freaking magic.
Very
Alright. So now,
Yeah, I
speech and
would
debate,
literally not
so-
be able to.
I said that to you.
What ifs? I'm not wearing a tie.
don't need a tie. You look too sexy.
Here, open.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Hey mom, I'm on TV and I'm just here to tell you that I made it.
Revolted.
And so, let's see. Yeah.
We can cut it.
Well, yeah, we're talking.
Okay, there's a dog
There's a dog.
in the library.
In the UofA jacket.
Can't be legal. Alright. Okay, so Dana, tell me. Okay, Nancy, thank you for being on the show.